It's funny in a way how letting go isn't really about the other person at all. It's about you, about finding the strength to release the things that have weighed you down for far too long, to finally accept that your story doesn't have to be written by someone else. After the divorce was finalized, after everything was said and done, I started focusing on what mattered. I focused on me. My business had grown steadily through the years, and now I finally had the time to give it the attention it deserved. My clients respected me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt that confidence return. I could take charge. I could make decisions for myself, without someone looking over my shoulder, without the constant background noise of betrayal. I realized I had been so busy trying to fix things for everyone else that I had forgotten about my own happiness. I had spent years trying to make a marriage work with someone who wasn't willing to meet me halfway. I had given everything, only to watch it slip through my fingers. But now I was free. And in that freedom, I found the space to breathe, to rediscover my own needs and desires. I reconnected with the things that made me feel alive again. I started taking weekend trips to places I had always wanted to visit. I began working out more, finding peace in the quiet mornings. I even started to write again, writing not just for work, but for me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. I found new friends, people who supported me, people who didn't question my choices, people who saw me for who I was, not who they expected me to be. I built new relationships that didn't come with strings attached, that didn't require me to give more than I had. And most importantly, I found the courage to trust again. Not in anyone else, not yet, but in myself. As for Daniel, I heard through the grapevine that he had tried to reach out to Sabrina once more, but it didn't matter. By that point, I had already moved on. The man I had married, the man I thought I could trust, had shown me exactly who he was. And that person wasn't someone I could share my life with anymore. The truth about all of this? You can't force someone to love you. You can't force them to stay when they've already decided to leave. And sometimes you have to let them go, even if it feels like you're losing everything. But in doing so, you'll find yourself again. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I'm okay with that. The house feels quieter now, but in that silence, there's peace. There's growth. There's freedom. And that's all I need to move forward. This chapter is over, but the story, it's just beginning. I'm 18, a senior in high school, the kind of girl who keeps a color-coded planner because I hate surprises and I like knowing where my life is going. I'm not rebellious. I'm not reckless. I'm careful. That's why, when I started dating Chloe, no, in my version, his name had to be male, I remember thinking it felt almost unreal that something could be so easy. His name is Caleb, 17, funny in this effortless way that doesn't make anyone else the joke. The kind of guy who holds doors open without announcing it like he deserves applause. The kind of guy who listens when I speak, like my words are actually worth catching. We met in my senior year, one of those school moments that seems ordinary until you look back and realize it rewrote your whole life. I was sitting in the library after class trying to finish a history assignment when he dropped his backpack beside me and asked if the seat was taken. His smile was warm, not cocky. His eyes didn't do that scanning thing some guys do, like they're rating you. He just looked at me, like I was a person. We started with study sessions. Then we started walking to our cars together. Then we were getting milkshakes after football games, sharing fries, leaning into each other in the last row of the movie theater, like the world outside, that darkness couldn't touch us. 8 months. That's how long we'd been together when everything started to change. And for the first 5 months, my house wasn't a problem. My parents liked him. My mom would ask him about school and offer snacks like she was trying to adopt him. My dad would do the dad thing, barely smiling but still nodding like approved. Caleb fit into my life like he'd been there all along. And then there was Mason, my uncle. Mason is my dad's younger brother, 28, and he'd been living with us for about a year after losing his job and getting evicted. My parents framed it like a temporary setback. He just needs time, my mom would say. My dad would shrug, like this was just what you did when family stumbled. Mason took the guest room, and then he took space. He didn't contribute much. No rent, no bills, no chores unless my dad snapped. Most days he sat in the living room with a controller in his hands, yelling at a screen like it had personally offended him. But when Caleb first started coming over, Mason seemed normal. He'd say hi, he'd make small talk, he'd toss out a, "What's up, man?" in that lazy way guys do when they want credit for friendliness without effort. At first I felt lucky. I'd heard stories about creepy relatives, about boyfriends being grilled by uncles with weird intensity, about families making teenage love feel like a trial. Mine didn't, or so I thought, because the shift wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow tilt. The first time I noticed anything, it was subtle. So subtle I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Caleb and I were in the kitchen after dinner. My mom was rinsing plates, and I was drying them. Caleb was leaning against the counter, talking about a science project. He looked relaxed, comfortable. Then Mason walked in. He didn't go to the fridge, he didn't grab a drink, he just paused. His eyes landed on Caleb and stayed there a beat too long. Not angry, not friendly, assessing. Then he smiled, small, tight, like he was wearing it because he'd practiced. "Caleb," he said, "still around, huh?" Caleb laughed politely. "Yeah, just hanging out." Mason nodded like he'd received information. And that should have been nothing. It was nothing, technically. But I felt a prickling in my skin I couldn't name. After that, Mason started appearing more when Caleb was over. He'd wander into the living room when we were watching a movie. He'd suddenly need to grab something from the hallway right outside my bedroom. He'd sit down in the same room even when he'd been upstairs for hours. And always, always, his attention landed on Caleb, like a finger pressing where a bruise would form. At first, I told myself it was jealousy. Jealousy that I had someone. Jealousy that Caleb was young and moving forward, while Mason was stuck. That explanation was comfortable. The truth was not. Because the moment that changed everything wasn't the first weird look. It was the moment Caleb stopped suggesting my house. He started saying things like, "Want to come over to mine instead? Let's meet at the coffee place. Maybe we can study at the library." And when I asked why, when I pushed gently, because I didn't want to corner him, Caleb finally exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for months. And he said, "It's your uncle. He makes me uncomfortable." My stomach dropped so hard it felt like gravity doubled. Because once someone says that out loud, you can't unhear it. And suddenly, every small moment I'd ignored started lining up like evidence. After Caleb said it out loud, everything rearranged itself in my head. It's strange how truth works like that. How it doesn't create new memories. It just relabels the old ones. Suddenly, moments I'd brushed off felt heavier. I started watching Mason the way you watch someone when you're trying to decide if your instincts are lying to you. When Caleb came over, Mason didn't hover in obvious ways. He never crossed lines you could point to and say that's it. He did something worse. He stayed just inside the gray. If Caleb sat on the couch, Mason would take the seat one cushion too close. If Caleb spoke, Mason interrupted. Not aggressively, just enough to redirect. If Caleb laughed at something, Mason would glance at me, then back at him, like he was evaluating a competition he hadn't agreed to enter. And the comments, they were always phrased as jokes. "So, you always here, or you planning to let her out of the house someday? Man, you're lucky. She's got her life together. That's rare." On the surface, harmless. Compliments, even. But Caleb would stiffen beside me. His shoulders would rise slightly, like his body was preparing for something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. I started noticing how Mason asked questions. Not about me, about him. Where he worked part-time, what time he got off, whether his parents were strict, if he planned on staying local after graduation. Once, when Caleb went to the bathroom, Mason leaned against the counter and said casually, "You sure this is serious?" I blinked. "What?" "You know," he shrugged. "High school stuff doesn't usually last." Something in his tone made my chest tighten. "It's serious to me," I said. Mason smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just saying, guys that age don't always know what they want." I told myself he was projecting. That Mason, unemployed and drifting, saw something he didn't have and resented it. That explanation worked, until it didn't. The night that cracked everything open was supposed to be normal. Caleb and I were in the living room watching a movie. My parents were out, which meant the house was quiet in that comfortable way that makes you forget you're not alone. About halfway through, Mason came downstairs. He didn't ask what we were watching, didn't grab food, didn't excuse himself. He just sat down, right next to Caleb. Not between us, never that obvious, but close enough that Caleb shifted uncomfortably. Mason started commenting on the movie. Loud. Unnecessary. Talking at Caleb, not to him. When a romantic scene played, Mason laughed. "She's hot," he said, nodding at the screen. Then he turned to Caleb. "But honestly, you've got better taste." Caleb froze. I felt heat rush to my face. "Okay," I said sharply, "that's weird." Mason lifted his hands. "Relax, just joking." Caleb didn't laugh. After that night, he didn't come over for almost 2 weeks. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. And when I asked him, really asked him, what was going on, his voice cracked, just slightly, when he said, "I don't feel safe around him." That word lodged in my chest like a stone. Safe. This wasn't about awkward jokes anymore. This wasn't about jealousy. This was about something wrong. I confronted Mason the next day. I told him to back off, to stop commenting, to stop inserting himself. He laughed, said I was overreacting, said he was just being friendly, said Caleb needed to toughen up. And that's when I realized the most terrifying part. Mason didn't think he had done anything wrong. And my parents? They were still making excuses. He's just lonely. He doesn't mean anything by it. You know how he is. But Caleb had stopped coming over, and my home, my safe place, had already changed shape. I just hadn't admitted it yet. After Caleb said it out loud, everything rearranged itself in my head. It's strange how truth works like that, how it doesn't create new memories. It just relabels the old ones. Suddenly, moments I'd brushed off felt heavier. I started watching Mason the way you watch someone when you're trying to decide if your instincts are lying to you. When Caleb came over, Mason didn't hover in obvious ways. He never crossed lines you could point to and say, "That's it." He did something worse. He stayed just inside the gray. If Caleb sat on the couch, Mason would take the seat one cushion too close. If Caleb spoke, Mason interrupted. Not aggressively, just enough to redirect. If Caleb laughed at something, Mason would glance at me, then back at him, like he was evaluating a competition he hadn't agreed to enter. And the comments, they were always phrased as jokes. "So, you always here? Or you planning to let her out of the house someday?" "Man, you're lucky. She's got her life together. That's rare." On the surface, harmless. Compliments even. But Caleb would stiffen beside me. His shoulders would rise slightly, like his body was preparing for something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. I started noticing how Mason asked questions. Not about me, about him. Where he worked part-time, what time he got off, whether his parents were strict, if he planned on staying local after graduation. Once, when Caleb went to the bathroom, Mason leaned against the counter and said casually, "You sure this is serious?" I blinked. "What?" "You know," he shrugged. "High school stuff doesn't usually last." Something in his tone made my chest tighten. "It's serious to me," I said. Mason smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just saying. Guys that age don't always know what they want." I told myself he was projecting. That Mason, unemployed and drifting, saw something he didn't have and resented it. That explanation worked, until it didn't. The night that cracked everything open was supposed to be normal. Caleb and I were in the living room watching a movie. My parents were out, which meant the house was quiet in that comfortable way that makes you forget you're not alone. About halfway through, Mason came downstairs. He didn't ask what we were watching, didn't grab food, didn't excuse himself. He just sat down, right next to Caleb, not between us, never that obvious, but close enough that Caleb shifted uncomfortably. Mason started commenting on the movie, loud, unnecessary, talking at Caleb, not to him. When a romantic scene played, Mason laughed. "She's hot," he said, nodding at the screen. Then he turned to Caleb. "But honestly, you've got better taste." Caleb froze. I felt heat rush to my face. "Okay," I said sharply. "That's weird." Mason lifted his hands. "Relax, just joking." Caleb didn't laugh. After that night, he didn't come over for almost 2 weeks. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. And when I asked him, really asked him, what was going on, his voice cracked just slightly when he said, "I don't feel safe around him." That word lodged in my chest like a stone. Safe. This wasn't about awkward jokes anymore. This wasn't about jealousy. This was about something wrong. I confronted Mason the next day. I told him to back off, to stop commenting, to stop inserting himself. He laughed, said I was overreacting, said he was just being friendly, said Caleb needed to toughen up. And that's when I realized the most terrifying part. Mason didn't think he'd done anything wrong. And my parents? They were still making excuses. He's just lonely. He doesn't mean anything by it. You know how he is. But Caleb had stopped coming over. And my home, my safe place, had already changed shape. I just hadn't admitted it yet. When Caleb texted me that morning, my heart sank before I even opened the message. I knew. I knew this wasn't just awkwardness anymore. It wasn't just Mason being social. I didn't need to read the message to understand that something had crossed over from uncomfortable to unacceptable. But when I saw the words on my phone screen, I froze. Your uncle showed up at my work. The simple sentence hit me like a punch in the chest. It wasn't even the fact that Mason had done it. It was the fact that he thought it was okay, that he thought it was normal to follow Caleb into a public space where people could see him and pretend like it was all just some friendly mistake. I texted Caleb immediately. What happened? What did he say? I had to know the details, the full picture. I needed to understand how far Mason had pushed. Caleb's reply came through in seconds. He came into the store while I was working. He said he was buying a gift for someone, but he kept asking about my shifts, my schedule. He even asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. It was weird. He was way too persistent. The pit in my stomach deepened. He was testing boundaries again, and he had no right to be doing this. Not in my home, not in my life, not to Caleb. But I still didn't have proof. There were no photos, no concrete evidence that Mason had gone too far in a way that could be used against him. I had nothing except the uncomfortable feeling curling in my gut, and that didn't feel like enough. That's when I realized I couldn't wait anymore. I couldn't just sit back and hope things would resolve on their own. I couldn't let my boyfriend be harassed by my uncle in my own home. I called Caleb as soon as I could. I needed to hear his voice, to gauge if he was okay. "Caleb," I said, my voice shaky, "I'm so sorry. I should have seen this coming." "Don't apologize," he said quickly. His voice was tight, but there was strength in it. "I just want you to know what's going on. You shouldn't have to deal with this either." "I'm going to talk to my parents," I said, a knot forming in my throat. "They need to understand how serious this is." Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. Then, quietly, "Do you think they'll listen?" I didn't have an answer for him, but I had to try. Later that day, I sat across from my parents in the living room, heart hammering. They had just finished dinner, and the house was quiet, almost too quiet. I started by telling them about what had happened between Caleb and Mason, how Mason had shown up at Caleb's work, how he had insisted on asking personal questions, how he had made Caleb feel unsafe. Their reactions were slow. I saw my mom's face shift from casual concern to something more serious. But my dad was defensive. "He's family," my dad said. "Mason's going through a tough time. He's not thinking straight." I shook my head, trying to keep my emotions in check. This isn't about him being confused or lonely. This is about him crossing lines. This is about him making Caleb uncomfortable. It's about him not respecting boundaries. My mom sighed, looking down at her lap, clearly torn. "I know you're upset, but Mason's not a bad person. He doesn't mean any harm." "I don't care if he means harm," I shot back. "It's what he's doing that matters, and it's not okay." My dad crossed his arms, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to back down. "So, what do you want us to do exactly?" I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, and I could feel my frustration bubbling up. I didn't want to keep defending Caleb, but I had no choice. I couldn't let this slip under the rug like it was nothing. "I want you to talk to Mason. Tell him to stay away from Caleb, and if he doesn't, we need to take real action. It's getting worse, and I don't want to wait until something more happens." My parents looked at each other for a long moment, not saying a word, and then my dad finally spoke. "We'll talk to him, but you're overreacting." It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but I had to settle for it, for now. I knew what I had to do next. I decided I wasn't going to wait for them to fix this. I was going to take matters into my own hands. That night, after everyone went to bed, I started making a plan. I couldn't just sit idly by anymore. I needed to get evidence, actual evidence, that Mason wasn't just being awkward. He was actively trying to intrude into Caleb's life. The next morning, I grabbed my phone and started documenting everything I could. The days that followed were a blur of dread and determination. I knew I couldn't trust that my parents would take the situation seriously, not when Mason was already being defended as just family. And I had no way of knowing if Mason's behavior would escalate again or if this would be the last time he crossed the line. But I had to prepare for the worst. I started keeping a record of every interaction. I made notes of the conversations I had with Caleb, the moments when Mason crossed into uncomfortable territory, and, more importantly, every time I felt that gnawing sense that something wasn't right. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Mason's behavior was increasingly manipulative, and I knew if I didn't do something soon, it would only get worse. Caleb, too, was growing more unsettled. His usual calm was wearing thin. He had stopped coming over to my house as frequently, citing things to do, but I could tell he was just avoiding Mason. I didn't blame him. The tension in my house was unbearable. Even when Mason was at home, he was nowhere to be found in the living room, where he used to lounge and play games all day. Now, he stayed in his room most of the time, only emerging at odd hours. He hardly interacted with my parents, and when he did, it was always with that same subtle, unnerving smile, like he knew something no one else did. I couldn't tell if he was guilty or if he was just playing a game where I had no say. The worst part was when Mason started to ask about Caleb's whereabouts again, even though he hadn't been around much. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but when I mentioned Caleb was with me, Mason casually asked, "Is he doing okay?" It wasn't the question, it was how he asked it, like he had a stake in it. I felt sick, and then came the text. It was late one night, about a week after my conversation with my parents. I had been preparing for a weekend getaway with Caleb, hoping it would help us both reset. But just as I was about to head out the door, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Caleb. "Mason came to my job today. He asked if I wanted to go for drinks after my shift." I stared at the screen, frozen. I quickly typed back. "Did you tell him no?" I told him I wasn't interested, but he kept pushing. He said he could be a good friend if I'd just give him a chance. I gripped the phone tighter. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It wasn't even about Mason being friendly. It was about him crossing every line. I called Caleb immediately, my heart pounding as I waited for him to pick up. He answered on the third ring. "Caleb," I said, trying to steady my voice, "this is not okay. We need to talk to someone. I can't just sit back and let this continue." "I know," he said softly. "But what do we do? Your family doesn't seem to care. I'm starting to feel like I'm overreacting, but it's getting harder to ignore." "I'm not going to ignore it anymore. We need to do something now before it gets worse." There was a pause, and I could hear him breathing. "We can't let him manipulate us anymore. If Mason shows up again, we need to have something concrete. We need proof." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Okay," I said, feeling a surge of determination. "I'll get the evidence. I'll confront him myself if I have to." The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't sit and wait for Mason to make the first move anymore. I was going to confront him directly and record the conversation if I had to. I waited until evening. When Mason came downstairs, I made my move. I walked into the living room, trying to keep my steps steady, my breath calm, but the knot in my stomach told me this was about to get real. "Mason," I said, my voice firm, "we need to talk." He looked up from his phone, the casual mask slipping into place. "What about?" "I've had enough of the games. You've crossed lines with Caleb, and you need to stop, now." He blinked, surprised. "What are you talking about?" "You showed up at his work today, Mason. You've been pushing him into situations he's made clear he's uncomfortable with. You're harassing him, and it needs to end." Mason's expression shifted from confusion to something colder, more guarded. "You're making this a bigger deal than it is. I'm just trying to be a good uncle. He's your boyfriend, right? It's not wrong to want to spend time with him." "You're not his friend, Mason. You've made him feel unsafe in his own space. You don't get to control how this goes anymore, not when you've been lying and pushing him." I took a deep breath. "This stops here, or I go to my parents, and I go to the police. Do you understand?" Mason's eyes flashed with something I couldn't name. He opened his mouth, but for once, the words didn't come. I stared at him, waiting for him to say something that would make me back down, but he didn't. Finally, he just nodded. "Fine," he muttered. "It won't happen again." But something about his tone made my skin crawl. I didn't believe him. I couldn't. The moment I walked away, I realized how little I trusted him. Even the apology sounded rehearsed, like he'd said it 1,000 times and didn't believe it himself. I had to act fast. I couldn't wait any longer. It had been a few days since my confrontation with Mason, and I thought for a fleeting moment that maybe, just maybe, he had finally understood that his behavior was unacceptable, that maybe the warning, the ultimatum, would have the desired effect. But that was before I found out just how deep his obsession ran. I had started to relax a little, thinking the worst was over. I spent a weekend with Caleb, just the two of us, away from the house and everything that had become suffocating. We rented a cabin by the lake, a place we could escape, recharge, and forget about the chaos for a while. The air was fresh, the sky clear, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I could breathe again. But when I came home to my apartment on Sunday evening, things had already started to change. I was unpacking my bag when I saw the text from Caleb. "Mason was at my work again. He asked about you, specifically if you were still hanging out with me." I froze. It wasn't just a passing comment. It wasn't harmless small talk. Mason was tracking our lives. He was checking in on Caleb, on me, asking about our whereabouts like a man on a mission. I texted Caleb back as quickly as I could, my heart pounding. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," Caleb's reply came back. "I feel like I can't escape him." The guilt hit me immediately. Caleb didn't deserve this. He shouldn't be dealing with this kind of harassment, especially not from someone in my family. But now it felt like the walls were closing in, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I went into full-blown panic mode. My mind raced through every possibility, every reason why Mason was doing this. I knew he was mentally unstable, but this was something else entirely. He wasn't just hovering anymore. He was actively seeking out information. He was stalking Caleb, and it was escalating. I had already called my parents to confront them about Mason before I left for the cabin, but even though they promised to speak to him, I didn't trust their ability to make him stop. Mason's behavior had proven that he was willing to do anything to get what he wanted, and I was beginning to realize that his obsession with controlling my life and Caleb's wasn't going to stop unless I took action. I couldn't rely on my family anymore. I couldn't wait for them to realize how serious the situation had become. I had to handle it myself. That night, as I sat in my apartment, staring at the empty walls, I felt a rising tide of dread. I hadn't heard from Mason since I confronted him. And maybe, just maybe, I told myself, he was finally listening. But then came the phone call. It was from Caleb. "Mason's at the mall again," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. "He's asking about my schedule again. I can't keep doing this." I felt sick. My blood ran cold. I couldn't let him do this to us anymore. I couldn't sit by and let him continue to manipulate Caleb, and I certainly couldn't ignore the fact that Mason wasn't taking the boundaries seriously. I had confronted him. I had asked him to stop, but he refused to listen. This was it. This was the moment I had to take control. I drove to the mall that evening, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it. I wasn't going to let anything distract me from this. When I arrived at the mall, I immediately saw Mason's car parked near the entrance. He was standing outside, talking to someone, Caleb. A cold wave of realization hit me. He had shown up again. And this time, it wasn't just about checking in on Caleb, it was about control. He saw me standing there, and for a moment we locked eyes. His expression was unreadable, but I could see it, a flicker of something dangerous behind that mask of calm. Like he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to catch him in the act. I walked toward them, trying to keep my voice steady. Caleb's face went pale when he saw me, but he didn't move. "Mason," I said, my voice low but firm. "We need to talk." Mason looked at me, almost amused. "What about?" I couldn't believe how casual he was about this. "You know exactly what I'm talking about." He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, waiting for me to continue. "I told you to stay away from Caleb," I said, taking a step forward. "But you're still here, still harassing him. And now you're following him to his job. What do you think you're doing?" Mason's smile faded. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't back down. "Get over it," he said, his voice hardening. "It's just conversation. I'm not the problem here. You're the one who doesn't see the bigger picture." "The bigger picture?" I repeated, stunned. "Mason, you've made Caleb uncomfortable. You've made me uncomfortable. And you think this is okay?" He didn't answer me. Instead, he looked at Caleb and then back at me, his expression shifting. "You really don't get it, do you? All of this. This has always been about control, about how much you let him control your life, about how much you let him control mine." Something in his tone shifted, something dark and final. My heart raced, but I didn't back down. "This is over, Mason. We're done here," I said, my voice unwavering. I turned to Caleb, who was standing beside me, his face a mix of confusion and fear. "Let's go. Now." We walked away, and Mason didn't follow. But I knew deep down this wasn't the end. This wasn't over. Mason had shown his hand. He wasn't going to stop until I did something that put an end to his toxic hold. I had never felt more unsure of myself than I did after walking away from Mason in the mall. It wasn't just the confrontation that shook me. It was the realization that despite everything, Mason had somehow convinced me to doubt my own instincts, that I was second-guessing whether I had the right to stand up for Caleb, to stand up for myself. I was angry. Angry at Mason. Angry at myself for not taking control sooner. Angry that for so long I had let my family downplay the severity of the situation. And I was furious that someone who claimed to be part of my family could manipulate us so easily, so quietly. But standing there in that parking lot, with Caleb by my side, I felt a shift inside me, a decision. I wasn't going to let Mason win. For so long, he had thought he could control the narrative, manipulate situations, and twist the people around him. He had been playing a game, and I had been playing by his rules. But not anymore. I knew it was time to take back control, to show Mason that his behavior wasn't just a nuisance, it was destructive, and I wouldn't stand by and let it tear my life apart. The next day, I set things in motion. I called Caleb immediately. He answered after the second ring. "I'm done being polite," I said, my voice more determined than I had ever heard it. "We need to make sure Mason knows we're not backing down. We're going to document everything. We're going to confront him head-on, and we're going to take action." I could hear the relief in Caleb's voice when he replied, "Finally." For the first time in months, the weight that had been hanging between us lifted slightly. Caleb had been so patient, so understanding, but I could see the exhaustion in his eyes whenever he looked at me. He was tired of running, tired of hiding. It was time to stop running. I went straight to my parents that afternoon, armed with everything I had collected, the texts, the phone calls, the confrontations, everything. I was done leaving things to chance. I wasn't going to allow Mason to keep manipulating us and acting like he had some divine right to cross boundaries. Mom, Dad, we need to talk about Mason, I started, sitting across from them at the kitchen table. Their initial reaction was, as always, shock, followed by defensive silence. My mom cleared her throat first, but she didn't say anything. She looked at my dad, who was rubbing his temple like he could already predict what was coming. Why is it that I have to keep coming to you with this and you still refuse to listen? Why does it always feel like you're trying to cover up for Mason? He's harassing Caleb and you're letting him do it. I felt the tension shift in the room. They were no longer sitting back, trying to avoid the issue. They were forced to face it, forced to realize the extent of Mason's behavior. My dad's voice was quiet but firm. We didn't think it was that serious. We didn't realize how far it had gone. Well, now you know, I said, feeling my anger rise again. He's not just being lonely or acting weird. He's been stalking Caleb, trying to control him, trying to manipulate both of us. And if you don't do something about it, I will. My mom's face flushed, and my dad looked like he was weighing his options. They had always excused Mason's actions because he was family, but I wasn't letting that slide anymore. You've been enabling this, I continued. You've made excuses for him, and look where it's gotten us. Look at how uncomfortable Caleb feels. Look at how he's been forced to tiptoe around Mason, just to keep the peace. I didn't know it had gotten this bad, my dad said, finally acknowledging what I had been saying for months. I'm telling you now, I said, my voice unwavering. This stops now. You need to talk to him. You need to make him understand that this isn't just a misunderstanding, that he can't just walk into our lives and destroy it just because he's family. My mom nodded, though reluctantly. We'll talk to him. I wasn't convinced by their words. I needed to take action. But the conversation marked a shift. They were finally on the same page. That evening, I called Caleb again. His voice was lighter this time, like the weight he had been carrying had loosened, just a little. You think they'll really do something? He asked, sounding hopeful but cautious. I don't know, I said honestly, but I'm going to make sure they do. If they don't, I'll make sure Mason knows how serious this is. And when Caleb's voice cracked slightly as he said, thanks, I knew I was on the right path. I was done being the victim in this story. I was done letting Mason dictate the terms of our lives. This was my moment. The turning point wasn't just confronting Mason. It was realizing that I had the power to take control. I didn't need to rely on anyone else. I could fix this myself. I had the strength, the courage, and the determination to make sure Mason's behavior would no longer tear apart everything I had worked so hard to build. The conversation with my parents didn't fix everything, but it changed the landscape of my life. Mason was no longer just a shadow that hovered in the background, a constant source of tension and anxiety. He was an active, dangerous part of our story, and I wasn't willing to let him remain that way. The next few days were filled with uncomfortable conversations. My parents finally approached Mason. I didn't hear much of what was said behind closed doors, but I could feel the shift when they came back to me. They were done making excuses, done protecting him. For once, they understood the gravity of what had been happening. We told him, my dad said one night as he sat down across from me, that his behavior was unacceptable. He denied it, of course, but we made it clear that if he crossed any more lines, he'd be out. I wasn't sure I believed them completely. Mason was stubborn, manipulative, and for all I knew, he could have easily played it off and wormed his way back into their good graces. But for now, this was a small victory, and I was ready to take whatever I could get. Does he get it? I asked, not masking the doubt in my voice. My dad looked at me, the expression on his face unreadable. He said he understood, but we'll see. Actions speak louder than words. And that was the truth. I couldn't take anything Mason said at face value. He had already proven himself to be a liar, a manipulator. He was willing to put Caleb through emotional turmoil just to keep a sense of control, and now I knew I couldn't wait for him to change on his own. I wasn't the only one who started pushing back. Caleb, after seeing that my parents were finally taking the situation seriously, began speaking up more too. He told his friends about Mason's behavior, about the manipulation he had endured, and how it had affected him. I watched as Caleb transformed from a guy who had kept his discomfort bottled up into someone who felt empowered to take control of his own narrative. The first time Caleb talked to his friends about it, I could see the weight lifting off his shoulders, and when we spent time together after that, he was less guarded, less worried about Mason looming over us. It was like he had finally realized that his feelings were valid and that he didn't have to suffer in silence anymore. The ripple effects were not just personal. Mason's behavior didn't just affect Caleb and me, it affected everyone around him. My parents, despite their initial denial, began distancing themselves from Mason. It started as small things, no longer covering for him, no longer making excuses for his poor behavior. And then finally, it became bigger. They told him he needed to find somewhere else to live. They had finally realized how serious his actions were, and they couldn't keep enabling him. Mason, of course, didn't take this well. He threw a fit, trying to guilt-trip my parents into backing down. But this time they didn't budge. They told him he had 2 weeks to move out. When I heard about it, I felt a sense of relief. I didn't want to have to choose between my family and my own peace of mind. But I had no choice anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine while Mason tore through our lives. Meanwhile, the situation with Caleb began to improve. The more we distanced ourselves from Mason and the tension in my home started to dissipate, the more I realized how toxic he had been to us. His influence had poisoned everything around him, but now we were free. Caleb came over more often. We had dinner with my parents a couple of times, and even though there was still an awkwardness in the air, it felt like we were moving forward. One evening, as we sat on the couch together, Caleb looked at me and smiled. "You know, for the first time in months, I feel like I can finally breathe." I smiled back, "Me too." For the first time, I saw how much of a toll Mason had taken on both of us. It wasn't just the obvious harassment, it was the fear, the tension, the constant sense of unease. We had both been walking on eggshells, pretending that everything was fine while Mason wreaked havoc in the background. But now we could breathe. Now we were free. Mason eventually moved out, but his fallout wasn't over. I found out a few weeks later that Mason had tried to reach out to my parents again, calling them, texting them, trying to explain himself one last time. My dad told me about it when I was over at their house one afternoon. "He's trying to get us to forgive him," my dad said, clearly annoyed. "Said he wants to come over and talk things through." I didn't even have to think about it. "Tell him no." "I already did," my dad said, half smiling, "but I just wanted you to know. He's still trying to make himself the victim here." I wasn't surprised. That was Mason's MO. He never took responsibility for his actions. Instead, he'd twist everything to make himself seem like the wronged party. But it didn't matter anymore. It didn't matter how many apologies he sent. The damage was done. By the time Mason's behavior had fully unraveled, everything in my life had changed. It was no longer about reacting to him. It was about moving forward, rebuilding the life I had started to fear might slip away from me. I had learned something invaluable through all of this. I didn't have to ask for permission to take control of my life. I'll never forget the relief I felt when Mason moved out. It was like finally releasing a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding in for so long. The weight of his presence, of the tension, the fear, was gone. It didn't happen overnight, but with each passing day, I could feel myself breathing a little easier. It was the beginning of something new, something I hadn't allowed myself to fully embrace until now. The next few months weren't perfect, of course. There were still moments of awkwardness between my parents and me, still moments where I wondered if they truly understood what Mason's actions had done to our family. But there were also new moments, moments of strength, of clarity, of love and trust. I didn't need their approval to move forward, but it felt good when they finally acknowledged the severity of what had happened. It felt good knowing that I didn't have to fight alone anymore. Caleb and I grew even closer after that. The relationship that had started so simply, so naturally, was given the space it needed to grow into something solid. We didn't have to tiptoe around the shadows anymore. There was no more hiding from Mason's presence, no more walking on eggshells. We could just be. And the more time we spent together, the more I realized something about myself. I had been letting fear dictate my life, letting it dictate my relationships, my choices. I had let Mason's manipulation control how I thought, how I acted. I had stayed silent for too long because I thought that's what people expected from me. I thought it was easier to go along with the flow, to ignore the discomfort, than to speak out and risk being seen as difficult. But standing up for myself, standing up for Caleb, wasn't difficult. It was empowering. It took me months to truly process everything, to understand just how much power I had been giving away. But I had learned an important lesson. I could create my own narrative. I didn't need Mason's permission to live my life the way I wanted to. I didn't need anyone's approval to be happy, to move forward, to choose who I allowed into my life and who I kept out. And if that meant cutting ties with someone, even family, then so be it. I had spent too long doubting myself, wondering if I was overreacting or if I was too sensitive. I had been made to feel like I didn't have the right to set boundaries. But now I knew my boundaries were mine to set. No one else had the right to push past them. No one else had the right to invalidate them. It wasn't just a victory over Mason. It was a victory over the fear that had been controlling me for years. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but it was mine to walk. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't walking it alone. As for Mason, I haven't heard from him in weeks. And honestly, I'm okay with that. I don't need an apology anymore. I don't need closure from someone who isn't capable of seeing their own flaws. But what I do need is to keep moving forward, to keep learning, to keep growing, to keep building the life I deserve on my own terms. And that, in the end, is the lesson. The lesson isn't about letting people get away with bad behavior. It's about realizing your own worth. It's about taking back your power. About refusing to let anyone, no matter who they are, treat you like you're invisible, like you don't matter. You don't need permission to stand up for yourself. You don't need permission to say, enough is enough. So if you're ever in a situation where you're unsure of your next step, remember, you have the power to decide. You have the right to take control of your life, to set your boundaries, and to never allow someone to make you feel small. And if anyone ever tries to cross those lines, you stand firm, you speak up, and you keep walking forward. Because no one gets to define you except for you.